Wesley, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for being here with us on Canary Wharfian today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexander. Pleased to be here.
Great. If you can kick us off by talking a little bit about your career path, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it all kind of started. I'm from the UK originally. I graduated in economics, and I think as I was kind of studying, I was thinking of a career in academia. So I kind of went all the way through my master's and even started to work towards a PhD, and ended in the most unlikely of places, actually at Cambridge, working with one of my undergraduate professors. And so at that time, trying to think of myself, as a PhD student in the early 20s, was I ever going to get out of academia? And I decided to take the biggest leap possible, which was to go from a sleepy, academic town in England to Tokyo in Japan, where I just basically went to try something completely different and ended up landing a role in Bloomberg, writing as a journalist out there. So I think that gave me, a real wake up call to what was life like outside of the academic sphere. And I kind of think that was straight into the deep end, starting early mornings, getting the first train to work, getting to, as the US markets closed, Asian open. So kind of got stuck into the whole, writing real-time news reports and learning about an entire region, the Asia Pacific, which has always stayed quite fascinating to me throughout my life. And also shows, I'm willing to take a risk and try something new. So that was kind of interesting start, but I think, yeah, what I was really trying to get into was more of a deeper research. Given I was working in academia before that, I wanted to do more research and strategy as well. So look for working in the banking sector in Japan. My fluency in Japanese wasn't good enough, so I ended up moving out to the US, where I worked for a consulting business. So I was lucky enough to make that massive leap from coming from London. Imagine going from Tokyo to New York was quite a quite an incredible thing to achieve, but I managed to do it. Although having said that, worked for a consulting company in a role, although it was an economics consultancy, I was more in the marketing and the sales, not in the research itself. So I kind of compromised a bit to try and make the transition. So after a year in doing that, I did decide to look for roles in banking. Couldn't get the visa this time in the US. So I actually came back to London and ended up working through a decade in investment banks, in strategy roles. So actually doing the thing that I really wanted to do when I was overseas. So got to kind of go deeper into the whole kind of cross asset space, looking at different strategies, global strategies and asset allocation. And then after 2008 was disrupting my career. I had to leave my first role in that strategy role, and then ended up working as an equity strategist, actually. So I went from more global role into a regional emerging EMEA equity strategy role. Did that for 5 years actually with Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, and really sort of, I think, found really quite an enjoyable balance between, working with equity analysts, working with the sales, with the trading desks, obviously pitching to clients and developing my own kind of brand. I became more of a frontier and emerging markets equity strategist. So it was quite interesting to be in the center of those types of markets like the Saudi, Middle East, Africa, all those kind of fast growing, massive potential markets. Did a lot of interesting work in that space. And again, more restructuring led me to work in a French bank in London at the time of the Brexit vote, which didn't spell a good future for me in terms of more instability in my career. So I ended up leaving that role. And it was actually at the time after that third redundancy, I had a knee injury, caused me to need physiotherapy. And that was the point really that I think my creative brain sort of triggered, as opposed to the logical one, thinking, how can I make this a better experience? And got to working on a health tech startup since that point, to try and develop a technology that could be used in the healthcare system and to help motivate people through that kind of experience, the physical rehabilitation journey. So yeah, been quite an interesting experience to go all the way I've just described from one to the end. But I think the common thread is actually, yeah, willing to try something new and seeing where it leads. And actually it did lead to some interesting opportunities and obviously working with some great people. So that's continuing on to this day.
Amazing, Wesley. That sounds super exciting. I love how you had the chance to live in very different cities, Japan, New York, London. Um, do I understand correctly that your investment banking experience was always in the equity research side?
So yeah, across assets, so global asset allocation and equity strategy were the two areas. The last role I had was at Societe Generale in asset allocation strategy. So yeah, within the space of 6 months, I'd get to work deeper with the equity analysts, the sales, the trading desk, and obviously investment clients as well, institutional investor clients. So yeah, kind of touched on quite a lot of the different parts of the business. So that was always quite frustrating when you'd learn, how the business operates and all the different people. I probably have like dozens and dozens of contacts that I would have developed very personal, close relationships with. To then have the restructuring happen was obviously quite difficult to deal with every time I had to kind of come in and do that.
So, in my understanding, typically people from equity research, they will move in terms of their exit from banking into something that's also finance related, whether it's at a hedge fund or a private equity firm or something of that nature. So it's interesting that you found your way to a health tech startup. Was that for you more like a passion-driven decision, or can you talk a little bit about like how you see the difference between what you did in terms of your exit and how people traditionally think about exits from institutions like investment banks, and maybe if you experienced any friction or fear for doing something that kind of went against the grain?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I actually feel like the industry itself is going through its own transition that, people that work in it are not quite sure where they are right now because there's so much disruption, so much change. And actually, it was fintech startups that first came to me as ideas for leaving the role I had. I was offered a role in a fintech startup, which I did not take because I felt it was so early stage, ironically, that I didn't want to take the risk, right? So that was one of the first experiences I had. And in fact, ironically, I mean, one of the direct competitors to me at Citigroup in the equity strategy role. I mean, she's working in interior design right now. She's completely left the industry herself, and these are very high-ranking, very competitive research teams that are now taking on roles that go completely beyond the realm of where they were. Others are in like real estate or other types of finance. So I think the kind of spread of people, and even my former boss is an independent consultant now, although in the finance sector. I think I did have a choice to make whether or not the industry I would work in was going to be finance or something completely different. Interestingly, though, even though it's a health tech startup, and I have enjoyed the experience that I have a personal, belief and mission in because I've gone through the experience of having surgery and long physiotherapy. Actually, the one thing I can do that no one else in the team, which is predominantly finance and sorry, predominantly healthcare and technology, is finance, is fundraising, and is running, operationally, running a business and setting a strategy. So those things I kind of play to my strengths on quite heavily. So in fact, I'm not really far away from what I was doing before. I'm pitching to investors. I'm, creating decks. I'm doing research. I'm doing kind of deep dive analysis on industries. Writing grant applications is not dissimilar to writing a report and a proposal for something to invest in on the back of that. So I do find like these skills are very, very transferable and doesn't feel like I'm kind of veering off too far, venturing out from my kind of core strength, which I think kind of, makes it feel like it's a little bit more, you can tolerate the transition. It's not so much of a shock to the system, right? So it feels very much like,
Wesley, you
home.
mentioned that there was a banker friend of yours that's now working in interior design, and my mother is an interior designer in London, and she said that a lady that was a former banker came to interview with her, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same person, actually.
Could be. It could be. Well, I mean, the funny thing is that they say that people who work in banking, especially investment banks, from a service perspective, can be some of the best people. Even when they come to like decorating and improve home improvements, you get the best service from people in banking. I find that to be quite an ironic statement to make, but it is true in the sense like the actual value that is placed on the customer relationship and how it's kind of one of the very rare traditional services that still feels like the customer is king and they do everything at the highest possible standard because it's so brutally competitive and easily you can switch from different companies to get the same service essentially. I feel like the customer relationship side of things is deeply ingrained, and I think those things will never go away for the foreseeable future, but it does mean that yeah, you can take that skill and run with it wherever you want to go.
So, Wesley, one of the common themes that I picked up on from what you did, and then from, for instance, this interior designer, from our conversation that I'm picking up, is that not everyone exits into finance as is kind of a traditionally held belief system. Um, is that right?
Well, I think it's an interesting question again. I think 20 years ago, I had this discussion very, very similarly, in fact, with some former colleagues about how the technology industry was going to draw away people from the industry, from the finance industry. And I don't think it was seen as anywhere near as deep and as well funded and as kind of maybe even as challenging or in terms of the skills it was demanding of the people that would go into those. I think it was seen as maybe a lighter and a softer industry. I guess now, in terms of the way that AI has penetrated all industries, the way that technology is being used, funded in terms of startups, and the way that the industry has evolved, I get the sense now that there's a little bit more understanding that this is a very, very credible career path, one that you can set for yourself, and that you can bring in people that are, extremely highly qualified, in terms of like, the Y Combinators or these other accelerators that really bring in the institutional money at the very, very earliest stages. I think that type of framework or that support network, I do imagine is going to only grow, bigger because it presents this sort of very repeatable and, as I say, transferable skill kind of, model where people who have been led to believe that a certain industry or a certain career path is the one they're going to follow. In fact, this is an interesting and a kind of, very appealing alternative path. And I think that trend is now become ingrained as well. And I think there's going to be an increasing number of people that look to set their own path and actually try and build businesses as opposed to trying to look for jobs in those. I think there's an interesting, contrast between being unemployable, but being the person who you're looking to create jobs for versus someone who is ultimately just going to keep doing a job for the rest of their life. And, it will be that type of personality. But I do think that attitude, that kind of the whole approach to this is going to have to change, especially with the technology and the disruption that's happened in the industry as well.
All right, so we talked about exiting. What about entering? It seems like I know my commonly held belief, at least what you know, what pertains to the United Kingdom, is that you need to study economics or finance at Oxford or Cambridge and then get into a bank, and that's the only really kind of way into a bulge bracket investment bank. Whereas your path seems to be a little bit alternative to that trajectory. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you found how you broke into investment banking, and give any advice to students that would like to get into investment banking, whether they should really pursue the more traditionally, let's say, routes, the traditional routes, or maybe do something a little bit crazy like go to Tokyo and look for a job in Bloomberg.
Well, I think that's the last word, isn't it? Bloomberg. Bloomberg, having access to the terminal was the really, I guess, secret weapon I had at the beginning because you basically got access to entire industry of people on a direct messaging system, or even just being able to gather their emails or read about what they're doing on the system. So you have this sort of interesting, priority access to people across the industry. And I think if you do ever get your hands on a Bloomberg terminal, some organizations, some academic institutions might have access to one from a finance department point of view. It just depends, right? Or you can just literally try and figure out how to get a trial for one. There's different ways and means to get access to different systems. But that was my way in, was just networking, and networking by just persistently messaging, getting in front of people, pulling out emails and trying to just kind of draw people into a conversation. And always, I say that with investment fundraising as well, from a startup's point of view. If you're trying to raise investment at very earliest stages, you're a bit like an employee, someone looking for a job, really. At the end of the day, you're trying to have a salary for doing something of value, right? So how you pitch that, how you approach the people that you're pitching to, do your background, read up on them as much as possible. There are ways, much easier ways, certainly now than I did 28 odd years ago, to get email addresses. There are platforms like Fiverr, they'll extract email addresses, professional email addresses, not personal emails, that you can find or scrape from the web. So there's various ways to do that. I think also an interesting one from a finance career point of view, and it certainly speaks to the kind of disruption that's happening right now. If you're a financial engineering, or if you're a kind of a developer by trade or by training, I think those skills, like learning Python or other types of programming languages, those will typically be now required to be things like quantitative strategist or an investment strategist or an asset allocation strategist. Being able to manage or create a portfolio, I think that is now becoming, to some extent, commoditized, but ultimately it still requires a core technology-driven skill set. So the ability to kind of code and create, some type of protectable or kind of sort of way of delivering or designing an investment strategy that you could not easily replicate. I think those types of approaches, if you are technically minded and can turn your hand to that, I think that's a kind of another secret weapon as opposed to the more networking ones I was talking about.
Yeah, we just had another guy on the podcast here who talked a lot about the impacts of AI and machine learning on hedge funds and trading desks inside of investment banks as well. So I think that's definitely a common theme that we're hearing. His advice to students that want to get into basically trading is to study computer science, not finance.
Right. Yeah, well, like I say, there's two ways. You can do it with the front door or by the back door, right? So there's always two ways to skin a cat. But I think, the fact remains, if you've got an understanding of who your ideal employer profile is, not customer in the case of other approaches, just try to understand who you're talking to. Just develop the relationships and understand what their requirements are. And some of them will be technical, but others will be non-technical. And you know, you have to figure out where you fit in.
So, for a student that's looking to break into equity research specifically within investment banking, can you walk us through a day in the life?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one. And I think I was very nicely set up for working in the investment banking world by working for Bloomberg. In fact, Bloomberg, I was getting a car to work at 4:15 in the morning because we would do in Asia, and when the US markets closed, we'd be preparing for the turnover there. So starting work at 6:30 in my banking role seemed like quite a sleep. You know, I have like a lion, right? I get 2 hours extra sleep. So you know, you're basically coming in the morning to pitch to the sales desk what your work is telling you, right? So you're trying to kind of start the day, that 6:30 morning call with the desk and explain to them why they need to get on the phone straight after that morning meeting at 7 o'clock and say to clients, you know, we're recommending buying this, we're recommending selling that. This is the reason, this is the story. If you want to have a follow-up call with our analyst or our strategy team, you know, let me know and we can set up the call and have the meeting. And that's the kind of the rhythm that you go through in the days. You're trying to basically compel people to take a certain action that they otherwise wouldn't do. Maybe they're surprised or entertained, but the bottom line is you need to make money for people, and that's the you know that's the kind of reputational pressure you're put under on a daily basis. So you start the day with the sales team. And ultimately, you need to build your own list of contacts who you can then get on the phone to straight away as well, and explain to them what work you're doing, what it's telling you, and whether or not they want to have a follow-up meeting or discuss over a lunch, and work that kind of company credit card as much as you possibly can to get in front of people and to spend time to get to know them and to explain what you're doing and how it should help them. So I think that kind of there's kind of multi-layered things. One is the ability to work under, quite a high pressure environment in terms of early morning pitching to people who are going to push back on you internally. Maybe they'll push back on you externally when you're working phones and you're doing this kind of, sort of telesales almost feels type of role where you're speaking to people in a very repetitive way that you're trying to tell the same story over and over again to. I think being comfortable telling a story is something that you need to be able to figure out, quickly in terms of how you can convey a message to somebody. And then obviously then put the phone down and get back to your desk and start, deep diving again, figuring out your next idea, or you'll have a kind of slow and fast lane on your research agenda. You'll be doing things that are more higher turnover. There'll be like a weekly report or a monthly report, and there'll be, typically hundreds or maybe many, many hundreds of charts to kind of refresh and analyze and scrutinize and extract the information that's most important to write a summary first page that's going to be the most, widely read piece of the whole report. And then ultimately you could work on like the longer term thematics or deeper dive pieces that could be more, kind of idea driven, or it could be more of an asset, kind of idea or trading idea that you're developing, or some kind of tactical, allocation strategy indicators. You could be building those kinds of kind of approaches. So you're trying to kind of sort of imagine yourself prioritizing what you're doing every day according to who you're talking to, what purpose it serves, and how are you kind of developing your brand. How is this work saying who you are and why you're different? And there's this kind of joke that the machine still runs without you, even if you left the bank. But, at the end of the day, if you put that aside, right, imagine like how the machine is different because you're there. Try and develop yourself and think that your brand matters, and, try and build your relationship up. So kind of walk the desk as they encourage people to do, go around the floor, both on the research and on the sales floor, and just try and get to know people, what makes them itch, figure out what they're interested in right now and see if they can, collaborate with you. If you're trying to get to a certain client, try and develop that. So there's just a lot of different angles to take. And I think the strategy role that I had, which is to kind of collectively, build a view that the equity analyst, the sector analyst can come behind and fall behind as a message. I think that was very rewarding because it helped them to sort of see whether or not their particular sector or stocks within their sectors are flavor of the month, and they can start to make even more noise about particular car or financial or consumer stocks, which are actually going to be in our must buy portfolio for the next 6, 12 months, whatever it is, or even longer term. So yeah, I feel like those relationships kind of important as well as the work you're doing.
Awesome. Wesley, listen, before we start winding down a little bit, we have about 10 minutes left. I really wanted to pick up on one a thing that you touched on in terms of being inside of it, like a deep dive in the numbers and in the data, and then having the ability to kind of like come to the surface and quickly kind of shoot a snapshot at somebody that's important that doesn't have the time to be doing those deep dives.
Yes.
Excuse me. And the reason I wanted to pick up on that is because when I first started, I worked for a family office for 6 years. And I came in there after having 2 years of sort of corporate finance experience at KPMG. And I really struggled with the ability to synthesize complex information for the shareholders. And it created a lot of tension between me and them because I thought it was impressive and important for me to be able to speak in great detail about all of the amazing and complicated work that I'm doing. Whereas actually, I was shooting myself in the foot because what they wanted to know was what is the actual synthesis, which can generally be communicated in one sentence, if not, or one or two, three sentences, but as you said, in a story. So anything that you can advise younger kids that are starting out in an equity analysis role on cultivating that skill set and the importance of cultivating it.
It's a really that's a great question. That kind of speaks to the world that we live in terms of how AI, if everything I was doing predated the use of AI, where you just throw in a ton of information and you just ask it to give you one sentence summaries of it, you kind of assume that it's going to be able to do that without any hesitation, right? Well, in the real world, I guess there's a kind of human, judgment element there that's not as easy to replicate, or at least currently it's not, but it maybe eventually it will be at some point in the not in a distant future, who knows? But I think it kind of comes down to the way that we extract information from what we read, and I kind of feel like I'm going back to the kind of journalism, but journalism is more than just about writing news. It's actually about, being aware of the world that we live in. It's about being able to read a long news article and then doing what's kind of termed in the industry as the nut graph, right? Just what is the actual takeaway message? If you had to summarize the key point, the thing that you're going to take away from that article, you need to be able to just kind of distill that down. And I think that is something that anyone very early on, I always remember myself as a student reading the Financial Times to kind of read about the budget or anything that was a major news event. And obviously, volumes of content is written about this, but you need to start to take away what is the real story. Like, what is it that you yourself find important and worth noting and remembering about something? Because there's so much information out there. There's always been a ton of information, but I think people are more conscious of the idea of how to take away messages and important information, filtering out what's important, what's not important. And I think that skill, you can definitely get that from the news by just being able to read and digest. Reading The Economist, and The Economist is very densely written, but it's actually intended for you to take away some interesting, topical ideas and thoughts that you should then be able to extract and do something or think about and go away and do something about it. So I feel like just being open to new ideas and the world that we live in, I think those are the starting points, the kind of the beginning of being able to formulate a view. And then ultimately, in terms of the industry itself, I think, having a journalist's mind or having someone who's aware of the worldly wise and just conscious of everything that's happening around you. If your country is not the biggest on the planet, just think about, how it fits into the broader scheme of things, in the world that we live in today, US versus China, or the rich versus the poor, the north versus south, whatever it is, you kind of try and think about the world and frame it in that way. You can then start to take ideas and play with those in a different light, because you're suddenly now not just thinking about the thing that's right in front of you, but you're putting it into context and actually being able to contextualize things. As they say, that's what real sense of humor is. Actually being able to have a sense of humor means seeing the change in context. And I think most people struggle with having if you thought enough, you can definitely, get most people's sense of humor if you see the context in which everything is placed. And I think that is something that people should just be aware of as well. So being able to put a humorous light on things can surprisingly make you realize how changes in context do matter. And everything you're reading and looking at, there's always context. There's always important context. So I think just trying to think about things in those lights can help you, and then help you to kind of see the other side, right? And that's where people look for contrarian views or for, alternative investment theses, or any kind of new and exciting or interesting ideas. I think those challenging consensus and challenging conventional wisdom, those things come from being able to take a broader and looking at things in the context of how things are. And so you can start from that in terms of reading around the news and what's happening in the world around you.
Amazing. Wesley, do you have any final words of wisdom or thoughts or advice to students in their undergraduate studies that are thinking about how to plan their career trajectory?
Yeah, that one I do think of that about a lot. And I feel like it's an interesting one for people, even in the later part of their careers, let alone at the start of it, to feel like they can do something, to have a confidence in themselves. I think that is so, so important. And I believe, like, at the very earliest stage of your career, you feel maybe a little bit intimidated. You feel like things are not possible or they're very difficult, right? None of those things prevent something from happening or being possible. So I feel like, not fearing and not thinking of yourself as inadequate or unable to do something. I think you'd be surprised how that alone can be an obstacle to being able to move forward in your career and actually trying something that maybe you otherwise wouldn't do. Like there's a lot of, underlying questions around, parents expecting their children to be a certain career or to have a certain income or to try something that they expect them to be doing. I feel like, young people and old need to have the ability to actually push back on this kind of conventional or maybe uninformed perspective, unless of course the person that you're talking to is a successful entrepreneur or someone. By the phrase successful entrepreneur, it means someone who has taken risk and understood that it's uncertain but actually tried their best and either did well at it or didn't, and if they didn't, they tried something else and got back up and tried something else. I feel like just that capability of being willing to fail and to learn from something from your own experience and not go by what other people tell you. I think I'd wish I'd had that a little bit more in my toolkit at the very beginning of my career. Having said that, I did try. Everything I've done has been an attempt to try and make the most of. But it might even sound a little bit odd having everything I've just described say to you. But I do feel like in the middle of my career now, I'm basically, in a way, reinventing myself in ways that I'd hoped I'd have done, if I'd started out my career. If I'd gone down the conventional career path, I think I would have found maybe it wouldn't have been as rocky and as unstable as currently it is for me. But then again, the industry is going through a whole host of changes. You can't pick up a newspaper and not read about job cuts and industry restructuring, and especially in finance today. So I think just going in with eyes wide open and thinking about your career path as one that's going to be diverse and changing, but somewhere where you feel confident in your abilities to do something and you don't have to listen to what other people tell you. You can do it yourself and learn just as importantly how things really work.
Wesley, I feel like there was a lot of wisdom in what you just said. Thank you very much for being with us on Canary Wharfian. It was a pleasure to speak with you today,
Yeah,
and we'll have you back again sometime in the near future.
no worries. Thanks for the time. Cheers.
Ciao.
Bye.